Hi there, and welcome back to Dreamoria. Tonight we are talking about the three faces of Christmas, a tale where kindness, judgment, and frostbound wonder share the same shadowed road. We will follow Saint Nicholas, the quiet giver of mercy whose legends grew from real history into sacred folklore. We will face Krampus, the horned reckoner of the Alpine night, born of older fears and later chained to the saint as his dark companion. And we will travel east into the realm of Grandfather Frost, the Russian Ice King, a power once feared as winter itself and later welcomed as a keeper of gifts and New Year magic. If you enjoy these long mythic journeys, please like and subscribe. It is the best way to support Dreamoria. And if you feel like it, tell us in the comments which winter legend has always fascinated you most. Now get comfortable, let the cold stay outside the door, and let us begin. The story of Saint Nicholas begins in a world that does not yet know Christmas as we know it. There are no red coats, no reindeer, no chimneys, no tidy calendars that promise comfort at the end of the year. There is only an empire that feels too large to love and too powerful to question, and a coastline where the sun can be gentle in the morning and ruthless by nightfall. Myra sits in Lycia, in the southern reaches of what is now Turkey, a place of stone streets and salt air, where ships bring news, rumor, and danger in equal measure. The city lives on trade, faith, and the quiet hope that tomorrow will not be worse than today. Nicholas is born into wealth. That is the first irony of a man who will later be remembered as the patron of the poor. The old traditions say his parents were devout Christians who raised him with a seriousness that felt unusual even for an age that took the divine personally. Christianity is still a young power in these parts of the world, still contested, still touched by memories of persecution and the uncertainty of politics. To be a Christian in the 3rd and early 4th century is to belong to a community bound not only by worship, but by risk. Faith in such an era is not a fashionable identity. It is a promise you may be asked to pay for. The stories say Nicholas learns compassion early, not as a pious pose, but as a practical instinct. He sees the fragile math of survival, a bad harvest, and a family misses meals. A ship lost at sea, and a household collapses into debt. A corrupt official and a good man is ruined. Myra, like many cities of the empire, is not cruel because it loves cruelty. It is cruel because it is an honest mirror of the world at large. When Nicholas is still young, his parents die, leaving him an inheritance that could have made him a comfortable citizen of the late Roman order. He could have bought land, leveraged influence, joined the social machinery that turns wealth into power and power into more wealth. Instead, the legend insists he begins to give, quietly at first, then with more focus, as if generosity for him is not a moral ornament but a form of duty. Here is where the most famous account enters. A poor man in the city has 3 daughters and no dowries for them. The details vary across centuries, but the fear in the story is consistent. Without money for marriage, the girls face a future of shrinking options, a slow slide toward desperation. Nicholas hears of their plight and decides to act without revealing himself. He goes by night. He brings gold. In one version, he tosses a bag through a window. In another, he slips it where it will be found at dawn. The father, overwhelmed by both relief and the mystery of this anonymous mercy, keeps watch to discover the benefactor. When he finally catches Nicholas in the act, Nicholas begs him not to spread the tale. This moment is the seed of an entire future myth, the secret gift given out of love and not out of vanity, the help that arrives like a miracle but is rooted in human choice. It is not difficult to see why this story survives. It is not only charming, it is a wish that humanity can still surprise itself with goodness. If we stay close to what history can say with caution, Nicholas likely did become Bishop of Myra. The office of bishop in those times was not simply religious, it was social. Bishops mediated disputes, organized aid, and served as moral centers in a restless society. A good bishop could steady a city. A corrupt one could deepen its injuries. Nicholas, in the accumulated memory of the faithful, becomes the ideal example of what such a leader should be. The miracles associated with him are numerous, and not all can be traced to early accounts. Some stories grow in the medieval world, where saints become larger than life because the anxieties of life feel larger too. Yet even when the details are embellished, the pattern is revealing. Nicholas is repeatedly portrayed as a rescuer of the vulnerable. He is the saint who steps between innocence and harm. One terrifying tale tells of 3 children murdered by a butcher and concealed in brine. Nicholas arrives, senses the truth, and restores the children to life through prayer. Whether this episode is a later legend or a symbolic story inspired by older fears, it captures the social role Nicholas came to occupy. In folktale logic, the saint does not only bless, he corrects the world's worst distortions. He is the answer to the question every parent whispers in the dark: who will protect my child when I cannot? Another cluster of stories ties Nicholas to the sea. Sailors in the eastern Mediterranean lived with danger as a constant companion. Storms could rise quickly, navigation could fail. Pirates and war could shatter a voyage that began with hope. In the legends, Nicholas appears in a tempest, directs the crew, prays and calms the waves. He becomes a patron of sailors because people needed a guardian who understood the ocean's hunger. These tales reveal a deeper truth about how saints are made in popular memory. A saint does not grow famous only because he was good. He grows famous because he becomes useful to the emotional survival of a community. Nicholas becomes a figure people can call on in the most frightening moments of ordinary life. He is the patron of children because childhood is fragile. He is the patron of sailors because the sea is relentless. He is the patron of the poor because poverty was a common language of suffering in the empire. The politics of the era add tension around him. The Roman world is shifting, Christianity is moving from a persecuted minority into a faith stepping toward legitimacy and even power. The controversies about doctrine that later centuries will recite with scholarly confidence were at the time felt as matters of cosmic order. What should Christians believe about the nature of Christ? What is heresy and what is truth? The later story that Nicholas struck Arius at the Council of Nicaea is probably legendary, but it carries the sense of Nicholas as a man who could be gentle to the weak and fierce in defense of what he believed to be sacred coherence. For the purposes of myth and legend, that blend of softness and steel is essential. Nicholas is not remembered as an abstractly sweet figure. He is remembered as a holy protector with a spine. As the years move forward, the story of Nicholas becomes part of the living ritual of winter. The date of his feast day, December 6, sits near the beginning of Advent in many Christian calendars. The season of waiting before Christmas was already taking shape in the European imagination, and a saint whose defining trait was gift-giving naturally became a focal point for children. In various regions across centuries, children would place shoes or stockings out and receive small gifts in them in honor of Nicholas. That custom is not a modern invention. It is one of the bridges between the historical bishop and the later supernatural image of a winter visitor who notices behavior and brings reward. This is where our larger story begins to cast longer shadows. A holiday that celebrates virtue often grows a companion myth that enforces it. The kinder the giver, the sharper the imagined threat of punishment for those who reject the moral order. In many parts of Europe, Saint Nicholas is accompanied by a darker figure. Names differ by region, but the logic is the same. The saint rewards, the companion warns. The saint offers sweets, the companion offers consequences. The best known of these companions in the modern imagination is Krampus, a horned punisher of the Alpine tradition who visits on the night before St. Nicholas Day. Whether Krampus began as a rooted pre-Christian spirit or as a later folkloric invention is debated by scholars, but the cultural function is clear. The pairing of a holy bishop and a terrifying enforcer creates a balanced moral theatre for the winter household. We are not yet in the mountains. We are still in Myra. But this is the moment when the narrative of Nicholas must be understood as more than a localized story of goodness. The historical man becomes a mythic axis. Later, cultures will place different weights on that axis. Some will emphasize warmth and generosity. Others will insist on discipline alongside joy. The mythology of winter is never one thing. It is the human psyche negotiating the darkness of the year with stories that promise order. The older the tradition becomes, the more Nicholas is drawn into a cosmic role. The saint's life becomes a kind of charter for how the winter season should feel. Charity should be secret, not performative. Goodness should be specific, not theoretical. Children should be cherished, not merely tolerated. The poor should be protected, not blamed for their misfortune. These are not sentimental statements in a late Roman city. They are radical. Nicholas appears in stories as someone who uses his authority against injustice. One tale claims he intervened to prevent the execution of innocent men. Another suggests he confronted local officials who abused the powerless. The details may drift from verifiable history, but they remain consistent with the kind of saint communities desired. They wanted a holy figure who did not simply offer prayers. They wanted one who was brave enough to challenge the machinery of cruelty. This is especially important for an adult telling of the myth. The children's version of Saint Nicholas is bright and uncomplicated. The older, more original atmosphere around him is more textured. He lives at the seam between faith and empire. He must negotiate a world where poverty is not only unfortunate, but politically convenient. He must confront an environment where the exploitation of the vulnerable is a silent industry. That is why the legends of Nicholas strike such deep notes. He is a saint of intervention. He changes outcomes. In the decades after his death, devotion to Nicholas spreads. The precise historical mechanisms are complex, but the emotional ones are simple. Stories travel along trade routes and pilgrim roads. Sailors carry his name from port to port. Families pass his tales to children who will later become parents themselves. Churches are built in his honor. His relics become an object of veneration, especially after they were brought to Bari in the 11th century, which further enlarged his fame in the Western Christian world. At that point, Nicholas is no longer only a saint of one city, he is a saint of a continent. This expansion transforms him from a local protector into a kind of winter archetype. The shift is slow, the way folklore always is. A bishop in a Mediterranean city becomes a gift-bearer in the north. A religious figure becomes a cultural one. A historical memory merges with older winter traditions and local spirits of the season. Over time, Saint Nicholas becomes Sinterklaas in the Low Countries. The name Santa Claus will eventually be derived from that tradition. Father Christmas in England intersects with him in later cultural blending. The modern image of Santa is a product of literature, illustration, commerce, and a long chain of folk memory. But even in the most contemporary version, the moral structure remains anchored in Nicholas's myth. Gifts for the good, coal for the naughty. The idea that behavior matters and that kindness can be rewarded. In this first chapter of our story, what matters most is not the later transformation, but the foundation. The foundation is a man whose generosity was remembered as miraculous because it was practiced with unusual devotion. The historical Nicholas, insofar as we can see him through the fog of centuries, seems to have been a figure of charisma and moral clarity. The legendary Nicholas becomes a vessel for everything a community wanted winter to mean. Hope in the dark, protection in uncertainty, a reminder that wealth can be used as a tool of rescue rather than domination. As the sun sets over Myra in our telling, the city is lit by oil lamps and small domestic fires. The sea goes dark and reflective. The harbour quiets. Somewhere in a modest home, a father who once feared for his daughters' futures watches them sleep in safety. Somewhere on a ship anchored near the coast, a sailor whispers a prayer of thanks because he believes a saint now watches the waters with compassionate eyes. Somewhere in a narrow street, a child who has known hunger falls asleep with a full belly because a bishop decided that anonymous generosity was a sacred form of power. Nicholas's story is not yet the story of Christmas. It is the story of a moral imagination that will eventually become Christmas's beating heart. The winter season is still young in the calendar of myth. The darker companion has not yet stepped fully into view. The Frost King of the East has not yet approached the frontier of this tale. For now, there is only the warm, steadfast light of a saint who made mercy feel like a force that could stand against the world. The lamps of Myra burn late into the evening, and the sea breathes against the stones of the harbour, and the name Nicholas begins its long journey towards snow. After Nicholas died, the sea did what it always did in Myra. It kept moving. The harbour swallowed the sounds of grief and replaced them with gull cries and the thud of cargo against planks. A saint's death, even a beloved one, does not stop commerce or storms or the slow turning of political fortunes. Yet in the private rooms of the faithful, in the corners of taverns where sailors warmed their hands around cups of bitter wine, in the kitchens of poor families who measured winter by the thinness of their bread, a name lingered like incense that refused to fade. Nicholas had been a bishop of one city, but his reputation had been built from the raw materials of survival, and survival stories travel. A miracle tale can cross a sea faster than any ship, because it is carried not by wood and sail, but by fear and hope. In the decades after his death, Nicholas's memory began to loosen from the geography of Lycia and attach itself to the larger map of human need. Wherever children were vulnerable, wherever poverty pressed like a hand on the throat, wherever sailors feared the indifferent appetite of water, people recognized the shape of the saint they wanted. They wanted a guardian who was firm enough to confront injustice and gentle enough to carry gifts in secret. They wanted the ideal of a good man who turned wealth into rescue. The early medieval world was a dangerous stage for such long memories, and that danger only sharpened the hunger for saints who could serve as anchors. Europa was shifting under endless pressures. Empires fractured, kingdoms rose and fell, trade routes changed, and new threats arrived on the horizon with regular cruelty. Yet devotion to Nicholas spread with a quiet persistence. Churches were dedicated in his name in coastal cities where sailors swore they had been saved by his intercession, and inland towns followed suit as stories of his generosity grew. The Feast of St. Nicholas, on December 6, emerged as a moment that belonged to children. In some regions, teachers and clergy presided over ceremonies where a child might even be chosen to play the role of a boy bishop for the day, a reminder that innocence could hold a kind of sacred authority. Families began to mark the feast with small gifts, nuts, dried fruit, coins, simple tokens that were not meant to rival the extravagance of royal courts, but to echo the idea of Nicholas as a giver who loved the unnoticed act. Shoes were placed by doors. Small stockings or pouches were left in windows. The habit was practical and symbolic at once. Children had something tangible to anticipate in a season that otherwise was cold, dark, and full of chores, that did not care about childhood dreams. Nicholas's story was entering the architecture of winter itself. As centuries turned, the legend grew bolder and became porous, absorbing the local customs of the places it visited. This is how myth behaves in the real world. It does not conquer other beliefs by force. It mingles with them until the border between old and new becomes difficult to see. In the north, the winter solstice had long been a time of spirits and omens. Older pagan traditions had their own sky riders, their own winter wanderers, their own stern judges of behavior. Some scholars later would point to the figure of Odin and the Wild Hunt, a god who rode through the winter night with a retinue of spectral riders, sometimes imagined as rewarding the hospitable and punishing the rude. Whether or not these influences directly shaped the Nicholas tradition in every region, the resemblance is suggestive. A winter visitor who observes human behavior is an ancient idea. The saint slotted into that archetype not because he resembled a pagan god in doctrine, but because he resembled the role that winter myths often assign to a supernatural presence. The season of scarcity needs a story that makes morality feel meaningful. People living close to hunger are rarely comforted by tales of randomness. They want to believe that decency matters even when the world appears indifferent. The Netherlands became one of the most important crossroads in this transformation. There, Nicholas became Sinterklaas, a figure still recognizably episcopal, wearing the garments of a bishop and arriving not in secret but with ceremony. He traveled by horse, a white steed in many traditions, and in later imagination he came from Spain, a geographic detail that hints at medieval trade connections and political memory. Children were taught to place shoes out with a small offering, perhaps a carrot or hay for the horse, and in return they might find treats or coins. The ritual created a compact between the human household and the saintly visitor. Be kind, be truthful, help your parents. The saint sees you, the saint rewards you. The logic is simple enough for a child, but it is also a tidy framework for parents trying to teach order in a world that could be brutal without warning. These domestic customs carried Nicholas further away from Myra, and closer toward the winter role he would eventually occupy across the Atlantic. The story's next great metamorphosis was bound to migration and language. When Dutch settlers carried their traditions into the New World, the name Sinterklaas was heard by English speakers as Santa Claus, a linguistic transformation that would become one of the most powerful examples of how folklore can be reshaped by the accidents of sound. In the American colonies and later in the young United States, traditions were fertile and competitive. Different European customs collided in crowded cities. The English brought Father Christmas, a figure of festive warmth and seasonal cheer, not originally a gift giver to children so much as a personification of holiday abundance. The Germans brought Christkindl traditions and regional companions of St. Nicholas. The Dutch brought Sinterklaas. Over time, a cultural alchemy began. The saint began to lose some of his explicit ecclesiastical markers in popular imagery. The bishop's mitre became less central. The crozier faded. The old religious specificity gave way to a more generalized winter benefactor who could belong to a pluralistic society. Yet the moral backbone of the Nicholas myth survived, simply translated into new costumes. By the early 19th century, American writers and artists helped crystallize this changing figure. The famous poem, commonly known as "'Twas the Night Before Christmas", published in 1823, gave the gift-bringer a sleigh, reindeer, a round, cheerful body, and the intimate domestic theatre of a house visited while children slept. This portrayal moved the legend decisively toward the image of a cozy nocturnal visitor. The saint was becoming a household spirit. The emphasis shifted from church feast day ceremonies to private family wonder. The winter visitor was no longer only a bishop of sacred authority. He was a magical grandfather of the hearth. Later illustrators, most famously Thomas Nast in the 19th century, expanded the myth further, placing Santa in the North Pole and giving him workshops, elves, a logbook of good and bad behavior. The scale of the legend grew with the scale of industrial society. A small miracle of anonymous coins became a vast mythic economy of toy-making, moral surveillance, and global travel in a single night. These changes can be read cynically as the commercialization of a saint. That is not entirely wrong. The modern world has a talent for turning devotion into product. But it is also true that myths evolve to meet new emotional needs. The industrial era brought new kinds of anxieties. Cities were larger, families were more mobile. The old village rhythms that anchored seasonal rituals began to weaken. A universal winter story, accessible to many backgrounds, became a kind of cultural glue. Santa Claus emerged as a figure who could keep the spirit of generosity alive, even in a rapidly changing society. If the Bishop of Myra had once been a local champion of the poor, the new Santa became a symbolic champion of childhood wonder itself. Still, the older European traditions did not vanish. They remained vigorous in their own landscapes, and in some places they pushed back against the newer Santa image. In the Low Countries, Sinterklaas continued to arrive in early December, preserving the older calendar logic of Nicholas's feast day. In parts of Germany and Austria, Saint Nicholas retained a more solemn presence, accompanied by stern figures who represented discipline. In France and other regions, local variants of Nicholas traditions persisted with their own unique costumes and rituals. The winter season became a theatre of parallel myths. Some were joyful, some were strict. Some were half-remembered echoes of pagan solstice rites. What bound them together was the sense that winter demanded both generosity and structure, that duality is the heartbeat of the Nicholas legacy. When we speak of the evolution from saint to Santa, the most fascinating truth is that the transformation was never a straight line. It was a braided stream. The historical bishop inspired devotional practice. The devotional practice merged with folk ritual. The folk ritual absorbed older winter archetypes. The modern cultural icon then exported itself back into the world through media. A child in one country might grow up with Santa on December 24, while a child in another might place shoes out on December 5 for St. Nicholas, and both would implicitly be inheritors of the same ancient story of secret mercy. The saint's gift travels through time like a coin that changes hands and grows more polished with each exchange. For an adult telling of this myth, there is a darker undertone worth acknowledging. The moment you create a supernatural judge of children's behavior, you also create the possibility of a shadow. The older legends understood this instinctively. A saint who rewards implies a force that corrects. The fear of being seen in your worst moments is as old as morality itself. The winter season, with its long nights and its historical association with scarcity, is fertile ground for tales of watchers. Saints and spirits became the imagined guardians of a moral economy that human communities struggled to enforce on their own. In medieval villages where survival required cooperation, a child who grew into a selfish adult could weaken the whole household. A legend that encouraged kindness was not only sentimental, it was socially protective. This is where the Nicholas tradition begins to cast a long silhouette toward the Alpine mountains and the future appearance of Krampus in our narrative. The companion figures of St. Nicholas across Europe were many, and not all were horned. Some were simply stern servants, some carried switches. Some were cautionary spirits that embodied the consequences of disobedience. The most vivid of these, the one that would later capture the modern imagination with its theatrical terror, was the horned punisher of the winter night. The Nicholas myth, once it left the Mediterranean, did not travel alone. It gathered attendants in the way a king gathers vassals. The saint's light needed a framework of shadow to make its lessons feel sharp. Yet there is another essential neighbor to the Nicholas legend, one that is not yet fully visible but will become crucial when we shift our gaze east. In Slavic worlds, winter had long been personified as a force with agency. Morosko was not initially a gift giver, but a power to be feared and respected. Over time, the Slavic winter spirit would evolve into Grandfather Frost, later Dead Moroz, a dignified elder who brought gifts for the new year. The relationship between Nicholas and this figure is not historical in a direct causal sense. They grew from different soils, but in the larger mythic landscape of winter, they occupy adjacent territories. Two wise elders of the cold season, one rooted in Christian sainthood, the other rooted in pre-Christian personifications of frost. Their coexistence reveals the deeper truth that winter stories are not just entertainment, they are cultural strategies for surviving darkness, both literal and psychological. In this chapter, we remain with Nicholas and his metamorphosis into Santa, but the air is growing colder around the edges of the narrative. The more universal the gift-bearer becomes, the more the season demands a fuller cast of characters to hold its moral and emotional weight. The modern Santa, in his broadest form, is a soft power of kindness. He exists not to terrify, but to inspire. Yet the tradition still preserves small reminders of judgment. Coal for the naughty, even when delivered with a wink, the list of good and bad. The idea that your private behavior matters to an unseen observer. These are survivals of older cultural instincts that once might have been embodied by harsher figures with rods and sacks. The transformation of Nicholas into Santa also tells a story about the evolution of sacred authority into cultural symbol. A saint is a figure of theology, tied to a community of belief. A cultural icon can roam more freely. When Santa becomes a global image, he becomes flexible enough to exist in secular households without requiring doctrinal commitment. This flexibility allowed the Nicholas tradition to survive the great religious and political disruptions of modern history, including the Reformation, which in some places tried to mute the cult of saints. Even where saint veneration was discouraged, the human desire for a winter gift-giver did not evaporate. In some regions, the Christ child or other figures took center stage. In others, local customs persisted quietly. The core need remained unchanged. People wanted a story that made generosity feel like a sacred act, even if the sacredness was cultural rather than explicitly religious. On a winter evening in a medieval town that might have been in the Rhineland or the Low Countries, you could have seen the transition happening in real time. The streets would be damp with cold fog. The smell of wood smoke would settle into clothing. Children would whisper about the coming one, the kindly visitor with knowledge of their year's worth of small moral adventures. Parents would reinforce the ritual, leaving shoes by doors, speaking the saint's name with a mixture of affection and authority. A few houses away, older villagers might still tell tales of earlier winter spirits, of horned wanderers or spectral riders, speaking of them not as gods but as cautionary remnants. In another generation, these strands would weave more tightly together. The saint would borrow the mystery of the spirit world. The spirits would be reassigned roles in a Christian moral calendar. Across time, that village would become one point in a vast chain of cultural transmission. As this chapter closes, the image of Nicholas is no longer confined to the warm shores of Lycia. He is moving north, changing his coat as the climate changes, absorbing new languages, new rituals, new anxieties. He is becoming the winter guardian of childhood in multiple forms at once. A bishop at dawn, a horseman on a feast day, a nocturnal visitor with reindeer in a later century, the same moral heart beating under new mythic skin. The snow has not yet fallen in our story, not deeply, not with the weight that will soon belong to Krampus and the Frost King. But the air is different now. The season is widening. The saint's path is stretching across nations. The logic of reward is firmly in place. The machinery of winter morality is being built in the quiet spaces of homes and churches and marketplaces. Somewhere beyond the peaks of the Alps, a darker companion is beginning to stir in the folklore of mountain villages, not yet fully formed in the imagination of the wider world, but waiting for the right night to step into legend. Somewhere far to the east, in forests that know a more severe cold, an older winter presence rules the frost with a stern patience that will later soften into grandeur. For now, the story remains with the saint who taught the world how to trust a gift that arrives in silence. The candles of early December flicker in windows across Europe. Children place their shoes with hopeful care, and the name of Nicholas, reshaped into new sounds and new faces, travels deeper into the heart of winter. The Alps do not care about tender myths. They are old mountains with ribs of stone and a memory of winters that have killed more men than swords ever did. In the high villages scattered across Austria and Bavaria, among forests where the trees stand like black spears against the snow, people learned early that the season of light needed a counterweight, a story with teeth. Saint Nicholas, in these lands, arrived as a gentle authority, a holy visitor whose reputation for generosity had traveled far from Myra and grown thick with wonder along the way. But the Alpine imagination was not satisfied with a single moral note. Mountain life forged a culture that respected kindness yet insisted on sternness. When you live where cold can be an executioner, you tend not to trust a world that offers only reward without a warning. So the winter season shaped a companion for the saint, and gave that companion a body that could hold every fear parents needed to place in their children's path. Krampus emerged from that pressure like a shadow stepping into firelight. The earliest clear documentary traces of the figure belong to later centuries, but his roots are commonly understood as older, braided with pre-Christian winter spirits and the stubborn survival of pagan imagery in remote landscapes. Even if scholars debate the exact lineage, the symbolic DNA is easy to read. Krampus is goat and man, hunger and law, chaos put into a harness. In some tellings, he is the devil's echo, a creature of hell assigned to a saint's service. In other tellings, he is older than the Christian calendar, a wild spirit of winter that the church tolerated by giving him a job to do. Either way, the result is one of the most vivid dualities in European folklore. The saint gives, the beast corrects. The moral economy of winter becomes a two-handed balance. To understand why this creature took hold, you have to step into the psychology of the season. Medieval and early modern life in the Alps could be harsh beyond what modern comfort can easily imagine. Food stores were calculated not in abundance but in endurance. A family did not ask whether they would feast, they asked whether they would last. Children were treasured because they represented future hands to work, fields, and tend animals. Yet children also needed discipline because a reckless habit could become a fatal mistake when conditions were unforgiving. Krampus served as a mythic teacher of consequence. If Saint Nicholas represented an ideal father of mercy, Krampus was the winter embodiment of the harsh lesson that actions ripple outward. A misbehaving child in the story is not merely rude, they are dangerous to the order that keeps the village alive. The image of Krampus is as theatrical as it is terrifying. He is often described with curved horns, a body thick with dark fur, a face that mixes animal features with human malice, and a mouth that cannot decide whether to grin or snarl. Chains are sometimes part of his iconography, possibly a Christian addition meant to suggest that evil is bound under the authority of the saint. In his hand he carries birch switches, the kind of rods that double as symbol and warning, since birch itself was associated with cleansing and discipline in older European customs. On his back, a sack, a basket, or a crude bundle of ropes waits like the threat of exile. In the darkest versions of the tale, Krampus does not merely punish with a swat, he carries bad children away. Where he takes them depends on the storyteller, sometimes to the woods, sometimes to a cave, sometimes to hell itself. The details shift, but the emotional impact remains consistent. The household needs an invisible boundary, and Krampus is the creature assigned to guard it. There is an adult truth buried in this frightful simplicity. Christmas myths are often treated as innocent decorations of culture, but their older versions were never only cute. They were partly social contracts disguised as wonder. The saint and the monster together created a moral theater that children could understand long before they could grasp law or theology. What is remarkable is how durable that theater has been. The modern phrase naughty and nice is a soft echo of harsh older logic. In the Alpine tradition, the division between good and bad is not a marketing slogan. It is a line drawn in snow with the blade of necessity. Krampus is most strongly associated with the night of December 5, the eve of St. Nicholas Day. That timing is not accidental. It places the threat immediately before the reward, so that the moral lesson feels fresh and immediate. The good child is reassured. The unruly child is warned. Parents gain an annual ritual of authority that does not come only from their own voice. They can borrow the voice of folklore, which is always larger than a single family. The saint arrives the next day with gifts, but Krampus arrives first to ask whether the household has earned them. Over the centuries, this myth spilled out of homes and into public life. The Krampuslauf, the Krampus Run, evolved into a communal spectacle where young men, and later whole groups of revelers, dressed in carved wooden masks with enormous horns, wore heavy furs, strapped on cowbells, and roamed the streets to rattle fear into the cheerful air. This was not purely cruelty. It was a winter carnival, a sanctioned chaos that let communities play with dread while keeping it under cultural control. There is something ancient in this impulse. Many societies create seasonal rites where the normal order is briefly inverted. The monster is allowed to dance so that the village can feel safe when it retreats again into story. If you imagine the scene in its earlier forms, you can sense the layered emotions of a cold night in a mountain town. The air is sharp enough to sting the lungs. The snow underfoot squeaks like a living thing. Torches throw orange light against the white world. The bells on the costumes create a metallic thunder that turns narrow streets into echo chambers of excitement and fear. Children press close to their parents with eyes wide as winter moons. The costumed Krampus figures charge forward, brandishing switches, then pull back in mock menace. Laughter erupts, but it is the kind of laughter that acknowledges the proximity of the terrifying, a carnival of discipline, a ritual that says we know winter is dangerous, we will not pretend otherwise, but we will meet it with shared tradition. The Church's relationship with Krampus was complicated. Christian authorities often tried to contain or suppress folk practices that felt too pagan, too chaotic, too close to older demons. In some periods, Krampus imagery was discouraged. In other periods, it was tolerated precisely because it could be framed as a moral tool in service of a saint. This tension is part of what makes Krampus such a fascinating figure for adult storytelling. He sits at the border of belief systems. He is evidence that cultural transformation is rarely total. When new religions or political structures arrive, they do not erase old fears, they repurpose them. Krampus is a piece of pre-Christian winter dread that found a new home in a Christian calendar. By the 19th century, Krampus was so embedded in Alpine culture that he spilled into visual art and holiday ephemera. The infamous Krampus postcards of the era, sometimes humorous, sometimes grotesque, show the creature carrying children in sacks, menacing women, or looming behind St. Nicholas as a lurid reminder that the season also belongs to punishment. These images were both moral warnings and mischievous entertainment. They reveal a society comfortable with blending the sacred and the monstrous in a single winter breath. Modern audiences sometimes treat these postcards as quirky curiosities. They were once a normal way of acknowledging that the holiday was a stage where fear and joy shared the same script. The political 20th century tried to tame this older beast in new ways. Some authoritarian movements viewed Krampus traditions as unruly or incompatible with their preferred moral aesthetics. The Church continued to have its own disputes with folk demonology, yet cultural memory proved stubborn. In recent decades, Krampus has experienced a resurgence of popularity not only in the regions where the myth was born, but in global pop culture. Festivals, parades, films, and books have revived the horned Punisher as a symbol that modern societies, even those far removed from alpine winters, find oddly satisfying. Perhaps it is because the contemporary world is saturated with sanitized nostalgia. Krampus offers an antidote. He reminds us that earlier cultures accepted the darkness of the season as part of its truth. The Alpine villages that nourished Krampus did not see him as a contradiction to the saint. They saw him as necessary. A child who received gifts without understanding their meaning might grow into a careless adult. A village that celebrated warmth without respecting the cold might become foolish in the face of real danger. Krampus was a story that let communities speak about discipline without needing to say it plainly. He allowed the winter season to hold a full range of emotions. That is why he persisted. He was useful, he was memorable, he was terrifying enough to command attention and theatrical enough to entertain. Imagine the myth as it might have been told in a stone house high in the Tyrolean mountains centuries ago. The wind scrapes the shutters, the hearth throws a restless light. A mother tells her son that St. Nicholas is coming. The boy is excited but also proud of the small rebellions he has gotten away with. The mother lowers her voice and reminds him that the saint does not always travel alone. She describes the horns, she describes the chains, she describes the switches and the sack. The boy laughs nervously. The mother does not smile. She's not trying to ruin his joy, she's trying to protect his future. The myth is doing its quiet work. Outside, the snow falls in silence, and somewhere on a road between villages, the sound of bells approaches. By dawn, the boy has decided to be better. That is the simplest form of the Krampus function, but for adult listeners and readers, the deeper form is what lingers. Krampus is proof that winter myths were built not only to entertain, but to stabilize social life. He is a vestige of older religious landscapes. He is a reminder of how fear can be harnessed toward moral education. He is also, in the modern imagination, a symbol of the shadows we still carry into our celebrations, even when we pretend we have outgrown them. As the evening settles over an alpine town in our story, the roofs gather a fresh skin of snow. The streets narrow under drifts. The church bell marks the hour with an iron voice. Families pull curtains tight and set small offerings in place for the saint. Children rehearse their good deeds in their minds like lines from a fragile play. The old story is about to repeat itself, or perhaps renew itself, which is what folklore really does. It allows a society to rehearse its values year after year with costumes, candles, and the breath of winter in the doorway. In the distance, the first torches are lit. The sound of bells rolls down the mountain like thunder that has learned to laugh. The night before St. Nicholas Day is not a gentle threshold in the Alpine mind. It is a hinge, a cold iron joint in the calendar, where the door to winter swings wider, and the village is reminded that generosity and discipline have always been siblings that share a bloodline. In the high valleys of Austria and Bavaria, December 5 is not merely a date, it is a mood that begins at dusk and thickens as the hour grows late. The air seems sharper, the snow more watchful, the darkness more deliberate. Parents speak more softly but with greater authority. Children do not need to be told what is coming. The year has taught them the rhythm of the story. Saint Nicholas is near, with his measured kindness and his ledger of good deeds. But Krampus is nearer still, and will arrive first like a question that must be answered before any blessing can be earned. The architecture of fear is built carefully in these traditions. It is not chaos for its own sake. It is ritual fear, structured enough to be meaningful and communal enough to feel like part of belonging. In a world where winter could mean hunger, frostbite, and the slow exhaustion of supplies, Krampusnacht became a way to make moral order feel as real as the cold. The villages learned to dramatize their values with masks and bells, with switches that were more symbol than injury, and with a mythology that allowed the saint to remain pure by assigning his shadow to another. The historical bones of this night are tangled, as most folk traditions are. Some scholars connect Krampus to older pre-Christian winter spirits, perhaps remnants of horned nature beings and solstice rites that survived in remote landscapes long after official religious reforms were declared. Others emphasize how the church gradually folded local fears into a Christian moral calendar, allowing the figure to exist so long as he served the saint. The presence of chains on Krampus in many representations may be a later Christian symbol, suggesting that the saint has power to restrain the darker force. The birch rods in his hand echo older European practices where birch was associated with purification and the frightening cleanliness of discipline. But the intellectual genealogy matters less to the villagers than the lived experience. What is undeniable is that by early modern times, the pairing of Saint Nicholas and a punishing companion had become culturally embedded across regions, with Krampus emerging as the most famous and visually dramatic of these attendants. The function of the myth was practical. Children who were reckless during a hard year could become adults who endangered the household. Cooperation was not a moral luxury. It was survival. A story that made consequences feel supernatural was a tool for shaping behavior when other tools were limited. Krampusnacht, therefore, became a community-wide lesson staged in fur and smoke. The fear was real, but it was also chosen, the way people choose the heat of a sauna or the sting of cold water because they believe discomfort can renew the body and sharpen the mind. If you want to understand how the night truly works, imagine not a modern parade first, but an older village evening when the world outside was quieter and the houses were lower, their roofs thick with snow and their windows small enough to keep warmth from leaking into the ruthless dark. The hearth dominates the interior. The air smells of pine, wool and soup heavy with root vegetables. Children are told to finish chores, to speak politely, to confess small mischiefs before the saint arrives, so that the household feels clean in spirit. There is laughter too, because the season does not survive on fear alone. But the laughter is careful. It has an edge. A father might pretend to listen at the door for bells. A mother might warn that Krampus has very good ears, and that lies are loud even when whispered. In these households, the myth does not need belief in a literal demon to function. It needs only the shared agreement that the story matters. Children place shoes not only in hope of sweets, but in hopes of proving they belong to the good half of the year's summary. The moral ledger is a metaphor, but a potent one. To a child, the idea that the winter world is watching is both terrifying and strangely comforting. It means that good behavior is not invisible. It means that kindness, helpfulness, and courage in small daily moments might be remembered. The public face of the night expands this private drama into something like a communal storm. In the wider Krampuslauf traditions, groups of costumed figures move through streets with bells strapped to their bodies, sometimes carrying torches that paint the snow orange and gold. The masks are often carved wood with exaggerated horns, wide mouths and fierce eyes, a craft tradition passed through generations. The costumes are heavy, made to look animal and ancient, as if the mountains themselves had grown fur. The parade is theatrical, but it is also a release valve. It lets the village embody its own winter dread together, rather than leaving each household to manage fear alone. In that sense, the Krampus run operates like a civic ritual of stress management. The monster is brought out into the square, where it can be laughed at, respected, and contained by social rules. The costumed Krampus might snap switches near spectators, chase teenagers who feign bravery, and rattle chains in a sound that turns the night into a living instrument. Yet there is an etiquette to the terror. The goal is not cruelty. The goal is the performance of consequence, a reminder that the season of gifts is not a season of entitlement. When the procession ends, the masks come off and the village returns to warmth. The monster retreats into story just in time for the saint's calm arrival the next morning. In many regions, the household visit remains the most intimate version of the tradition. Saint Nicholas arrives dressed as a bishop, carrying a staff that symbolizes spiritual authority, sometimes holding a book or scroll that represents the year's account of the children's behavior. Krampus follows or precedes him, depending on local custom, his presence reduced by wisdom into a controlled threat. The saint asks questions, praises good deeds, encourages honesty and improvement. The children recite poems or prayers, a ritual that allows them to participate actively in the moral economy rather than being passive recipients of judgment. Then Krampus enters the performance, sometimes snarling, sometimes silent, sometimes reduced to a theatrical growl that seems to carry all the wildness of the winter forest. The switches are displayed. The sack is shown. The children who have been kind and hard-working are reassured by the saint. The children who have been difficult might receive a stern warning, perhaps a symbolic tap of the birch rods, or a coal-like token that reminds them that the story is not only about reward. The genius of this ritual is that it allows both compassion and correction to exist in one narrative breath. The saint remains the embodiment of mercy. Krampus remains the embodiment of consequence. Together, they describe a moral universe that feels balanced rather than indulgent or cruel. There is a reason this myth remains so sturdy even in the modern era, when life in the Alps is no longer defined by medieval scarcity. The psychology of winter has not changed as much as technology has. Darkness still presses on the human mind in December. Families still want stories that make the season feel purposeful. Children still respond to narratives that turn behavior into a meaningful tale rather than a lecture. Krampus offers something that modern culture often avoids, the idea that joy has a cost in responsibility. The resurgence of Krampus imagery in recent decades, including festivals far beyond the Alps, reveals that many people find the older, darker edge of the holiday strangely appealing. It is a counterweight to saccharine nostalgia. It acknowledges that human nature includes mischief, selfishness, and the need for boundaries. The 19th century Krampus postcards, sometimes humorous and sometimes genuinely unsettling, show the same impulse. They capture a society that was comfortable acknowledging the monstrous as part of the seasonal conversation. The 20th century tried at different times to suppress or sanitize this folk demon, whether for religious reasons or political aesthetics, yet the figure endured. The monster was too useful to fully erase. In the larger arc of our story, this chapter is where the shadow becomes a fully developed character rather than a rumor at the edge of St. Nicholas's fame. The saint's transformation into Santa in other lands emphasizes warmth and generosity. The Alpine tradition keeps the older dual structure intact and refuses to pretend that winter has space for only one emotion. Krampusnacht is not the opposite of the holiday. It is one of its roots. It expresses the old European understanding that a community survives winter by building both compassion and discipline into its rituals. The vision is not cynical. It is protective. It says that goodness is precious enough to defend with fear if necessary, and that children are valued enough to be taught responsibility through myth rather than through cold punishment alone. As that night settles over the mountains, the village becomes a living stage. The snow falls with a steady patience. The bells echo from street to street. Children listen from behind curtains or stand in squares with their families, watching the horned figures move like a dark river of folklore. Somewhere, a saint in white and red prepares to enter a home with gentle dignity. Somewhere, a masked Krampus adjusts his bell strap and steps into his role. The season is about to speak with two voices, one soft as a blessing and one rough as antlers scraping wood. The last fires of evening deepen into coals behind shuttered windows, and the mountains hold their breath in a silence that feels older than any church. And the village waits for the moment when the door opens and the winter story steps inside. If the Alps taught Europe to imagine winter as a horned judge at the door, the Slavic forests taught an even older lesson. Winter was not merely a season, it was a sovereign. It was a presence that could be offended, bargained with, respected, feared, and in rare moments even loved. To step east in this story is to step into a colder grammar of myth, where the snow does not feel decorative and the night does not feel like a cozy backdrop for candles. Here the cold is a power with a long memory. It is the kind of power that shaped villages, diets, migration, and family structure long before the first church bells arrived. In these lands, the winter spirit did not begin as a kindly visitor who rewarded good children with sweets. He began as Morozko, the Frost King, a name that sounds like the crack of branches under ice and the last breath of a traveler who underestimated the road. The old Slavic worldview was layered, like the rings of a tree that has survived too many harsh seasons to count. The world was filled with forces that were not abstract ideas but tangible dangers. The forest had its own rulers. The river carried its own moods. The household itself was believed to have a spirit of protection and security if treated with proper respect. Winter, in that spiritual landscape, was the greatest of the visible threats, and therefore the most likely to acquire a face. Anthropologists and folklorists have long noted how likely extreme environments are to produce personified myths. When a season can kill you, you do not speak of it as a neutral backdrop. You speak of it as a being who can be placated and whose authority must be acknowledged. Morozko was that being. In the earliest folk memory, he is a frost demon, a winter wizard, a spirit who might be as old as the first human attempt to survive a northern cold snap. People told stories of him freezing rivers into roads and turning the air into a blade. In some regions, there were traditions of leaving offerings for the frost, a ritual not unlike the older human habit of feeding a god so that the god does not feed on you. The details differ from place to place because folk practice is always local, but the emotional logic is consistent. Winter was the powerful neighbor you could not ignore. You had to learn how to speak to him, even if your voice shook. The character of Morozko in these tales is not mindlessly evil. He is closer to a force of law, but a law shaped by weather rather than by courts. He punishes arrogance, laziness, greed, and cruelty in ways that feel severe because the world itself was severe. He rewards humility and endurance not because he is sentimental, but because humility and endurance were the virtues that kept people alive. A proud fool who wasted firewood could doom a household. A cruel stepmother who abused a child was not only morally wrong, she was an infection in communal stability. The folklore of Morozko becomes a cold mirror held up to human behavior. The most famous story of Morozko is still told in many forms, and its endurance is a clue to the shape of his mythic heart. A poor widower remarries. The new wife is harsh, and she favors her own daughter while treating her stepdaughter like a burden. The stepdaughter is kind, hard-working, and quiet in the way that many folk heroines must be, because the story wants her goodness to feel proven rather than announced. The stepmother, irritated by the girl's gentleness or perhaps threatened by it, decides to remove her. So she sends the stepdaughter into the winter woods, ordering her to fetch kindling or some other impossible task, with the hidden intention that the girl will freeze to death. This moment reveals the older reality that the tale is built upon. The forest in winter was a true killer. People could vanish in storms. Wolves were not the polite metaphors of bedtime stories, but genuine threats. Exposure could claim a life in hours. The folklore does not soften these facts. It uses them. It takes the real terror of winter travel and turns it into a stage where a supernatural judge can reveal his ethics. The girl sits in the snow, shivering as the wind rises. The trees creak above her like old bones. The world becomes white, and silence begins to feel like a physical weight. Then Morozko appears. Sometimes he is described leaping from tree to tree, a playful detail that contrasts with his grim power. Sometimes he emerges as a tall elder in a coat rimmed with frost, beard bright as hoarfrost, eyes sharp enough to see through excuses. He asks the girl if she is warm. The question is not kind. It is a test. The air around her is freezing. The honest answer would be no, but the girl responds with politeness and restraint, saying she is warm enough, calling him Father Frost with respect. This is the crucial hinge of the tale. Folk stories often reward cleverness or bravery. This one rewards dignity in suffering. The girl does not flatter him in a manipulative way. She speaks with a humility that an older culture valued intensely. In return, Morozko is moved or perhaps satisfied that the human being before him understands the proper relationship between mortal weakness and winter power. He does not kill her. Instead, he warms her, wraps her in fine furs, and presents her with gifts of wealth and beauty. When she returns home alive and prosperous, the stepmother's envy ignites. She sends her own daughter into the woods, expecting the same rewards. But this girl is rude, impatient, and contemptuous. She complains bitterly about the cold and treats Morozko as a servant obliged to obey her demands. Morozko, the story says, freezes her to death. It is a brutal lesson, but it is meant to be. The tale is not an argument for cruelty, it is an argument for respect. It tells children and adults alike that the world does not respond well to entitlement, particularly when that entitlement is directed at something as unyielding as winter. In an adult telling, this story becomes more than a moral fable. It becomes a snapshot of a survival culture. The stepmother's cruelty reflects the fear of scarcity twisted into abuse. The heroine's endurance reflects the reality that many people survived winter by quiet competence and emotional discipline. The punishment of the rude daughter reflects the community's suspicion of arrogance, a suspicion that was not merely philosophical but practical. If you cannot respect the cold will end you. It is also worth noticing how Morozko differs from Krampus. Krampus is an enforcer attached to a saintly system. His function becomes explicitly moral within a Christian calendar. Morozko is older and closer to nature. He does not need a saint to legitimize him. He is the cold personified, and his morality emerges from the environment rather than from theology. That difference gives him a more ambiguous grandeur. He can be generous, but his generosity is not gentle in the same way as St. Nicholas. It is majestic, conditional, and a little frightening even when it rewards you. The gifts Morozko gives are the gifts of a king whose kingdom is snow. This older image of Father Frost was viewed suspiciously by religious authorities when Christianity expanded into Slavic lands. Pagan practices were condemned, reinterpreted, or quietly tolerated depending on era and region. Yet Morozko did not vanish. He moved deeper into folklore. Parents kept telling stories that carried older instincts inside newer religious contexts. The church could say the frost spirit was a demon. The villagers could nod in public and then still leave a little bread near a windowsill in private when the cold was bitter enough to make even the brave grow humble. Through this long process, the Frost King began a slow and fascinating change. The transformation is not yet complete in this chapter, but you can see its earliest edges. As medieval and early modern cultures became more stable, and as winter rituals thickened with local celebration, Morosco's image softened in some areas from a pure punisher into a stern tester. The tale of the good stepdaughter already shows this. He is not a villain in that story. He is a judge with a harsh but understandable code. A being who responds to virtue and disrespect with equal clarity. This sets the stage for his later evolution into a gift-giver of the colder end of Europe. When a figure already contains both punishment and reward, it does not take much cultural pressure for the balance to tilt. A spirit who once demanded offerings can become a spirit who brings them. A king who once tested humans for survival worthiness can become an elder who tests them for moral readiness. The architecture is already there. The Slavic world also carried another important story thread that will matter in the next chapter when we reach Grandfather Frost in his more modern form. Local winter celebrations were never singular. They were mosaics of songs, household rituals, and seasonal rites that blended old and new. Over time, as Christian holidays and local calendars intertwined, winter celebrations became crowded with meaning. There were days for saints, days for household blessings, and the living memory of pre-Christian solstice customs that never fully died. In such a world, the Frost King could be both feared and invited. A story did not have to be purely one thing to survive. It could mutate until it fit the needs of a different century. For now, Morozko remains the rawer shape of the myth. He is winter's authority, before it learns to smile for children. He is the frost that does not negotiate with comfort. He is the long northern night, made into a character with a voice. The fact that he is imagined as an old man is itself meaningful. In many cultures, age represents both knowledge and danger. An elder of winter suggests a force that has seen human generations rise and fall and is unimpressed by fleeting arrogance. He is a reminder that nature is older than our problems and will still be here when our pride has turned to dust. In the narrative imagination of this story, the Slavic Frost King occupies a territory of myth that feels like an empire of ice. You can picture him ruling from a palace of frozen birch and silent rivers. You can imagine his servants as the creak of trees, the white breath of horses, the glittering crystals that form on window glass. He is not quite a god in the strict sense, but he is not merely a fairy tale creature either. He is an elemental sovereign. When he speaks, the air seems to tighten. When he walks, snow arranges itself around his steps, as if recognizing a master. This mythic aura is part of why his later transformation into a benevolent gift-bringer feels so striking. To make sense of that later evolution, we need to hold the earlier fear in mind. A softened winter story is only meaningful if we remember how hard winter once was. Imagine a village on the edge of deep forest, somewhere in the old Ruslands, centuries before modern borders settled into their current lines. The river nearby is a ribbon of ice. The roofs are weighted down by snow thick enough to silence footsteps. The village survives by storing grain, drying fish, and guarding firewood like treasure. Children are taught early to respect the cold. They are told not to wander too far at dusk. They are told that the frost has ears. They are told that Father Frost might be watching from the tree line, not as a cheerful grandfather, but as a ruler who expects courtesy the way the winter expects preparation. On such a night, a family hears the wind rise, and the father goes outside to check the shed to make sure the wood has not been stolen or soaked. He returns with his beard rimmed in ice. The mother adds more soup to the pot, stretching what they have. The children huddle close to the hearth. Someone tells the Morosco story again, the one about the good girl who spoke politely to winter and was rewarded with life and warmth. The story is not entertainment, it is instruction wrapped in wonder. In that room, you can feel the first faint steps toward the future image of Grandfather Frost. Not because the villagers knew what he would become, but because the story already makes a space for winter's authority to be fair. The Frost King is harsh, but he is not random. He listens, he evaluates. He responds to virtue with protection. That alone is a form of hope. Elsewhere in Europe, St. Nicholas had become the saint of gifts. In the Alps, Krampus had become the enforcer of consequence. In the Slavic world, Morosco was winter as a sovereign test. 3 different cultural solutions to the same fundamental problem of the season. How do you raise children under a sky that grows darker? How do you teach generosity, restraint, and resilience when survival itself demands all 3? The myths do not need to have initially known each other to eventually form a conceptual triad. Human needs often produce parallel stories. The convergence of these figures in our broader tale is not a claim of direct historical meeting. It is a recognition that winter across cultures generated a family of archetypes, each addressing the season from a different angle. When the snow begins to fall harder at the end of this chapter, it does not feel like a decorative closing. It feels like a door opening toward the next transformation. The Frost King is still severe, still ancient, still crowned with ice. But somewhere in the long corridor of time, new eras will ask him to soften, to adopt ceremony, to become less a predator of arrogance and more a guardian of winter joy. The Elder of Frost will eventually learn to carry gifts, and the world will learn to invite him in rather than only fear him from afar. For now, the forest is quiet, the river is locked, the houses are warm only because they are vigilant, and in the far reaches of the winter night, Morosco watches the smoke rise from Chelovecheskia homes and weighs the human heart with the patient intensity of cold. To understand how the Frost King became a grandfather of gifts, you have to accept that winter myths do not evolve politely. They change the way rivers change in freeze and thaw, sometimes by slow widening, sometimes by sudden breaks that sound like thunder in the dark. Morosco belonged to an older Slavic imagination that treated cold as law, not mood. He was the stern sovereign of endurance, the test that separated humility from arrogance, the force that did not apologize for the way nature could be both beautiful and lethal. But as the centuries moved forward, the people who lived under that sky changed too. Communities grew more connected to one another through trade and empire. Christianity deepened its grip on seasonal calendars. Western Europe's St. Nicholas traditions became louder through contact, literature, and the endless human habit of borrowing what is useful from a neighbor's story. At the same time, the Slavic world kept its stubborn reverence for winter as a dignified power rather than a mere enemy. Out of that tension came a transformation that was not a replacement of Morosco, but a rehabilitation of his image. The way a fierce king might soften into a wiser ruler without surrendering the authority that made him feared in the first place. The Frost King did not vanish into dust. He changed his coat, adjusted his role, and stepped into a new century with a different kind of power. The new face that emerged was Dead Moroz, Grandfather Frost, a figure who carries the weight of older pagan frost lore while inhabiting a more family-centered winter tradition. He is not the round, whimsical Santa of later American iconography, though the two share a gift-giving spirit. Dead Moroz is taller in the imagination, more regal, more like a winter patriarch whose kindness is earned by the gravity of his rule. His costume in folklore and later popular tradition is often a long, fur-lined coat, sometimes blue, sometimes red, sometimes white, embroidered with snow patterns. He holds a staff that looks less like a toy and more like a symbol of seasonal authority. He travels not with reindeer but with a troika of horses in many stories, a detail that ties him to the geography and cultural rhythm of Eastern Europe. He is frequently accompanied by Snegorochka, the Snow Maiden, who entered the cultural bloodstream through 19th century literature and performance, and later became an essential part of the modern Dead Moroz tradition. The presence of the Snow Maiden suggests an important shift. Older winter spirits often appear alone, like solitary forces of nature. The new Grandfather Frost arrives with family, with companionship, with a younger figure who bridges the stern grandeur of winter power and the playful tenderness of childhood celebration. Snegorochka carries her own rich lineage. In some folk tales, she is a child shaped from snow by an elderly couple who long for a daughter, a fragile miracle that can walk and speak until warmth threatens her existence. In the theatrical tradition, most famously in the play by Alexander Ostrovsky and the later opera by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, she becomes the daughter of winter and spring, torn between the frozen purity of her origin and the dangerous invitation of human emotion. The Snow Maiden myth is a quiet masterpiece of seasonal symbolism. She represents the beauty of winter that cannot survive the heat of full summer desire. She is wonder with a built-in expiration date. When she stands beside Dead Moroz in later celebrations, she softens the old king's image without erasing his ancient seriousness. Together they form a winter dyad that is different from the Nicholas and Krampus pairing of the Alps. Saint Nicholas and Krampus express the moral balance of reward and consequence. Dead Moroz and Snegorochka express the balance of authority and enchantment, the elder and the young, the long memory of cold and the ephemeral joy of snow that melts even as it dazzles. The 19th century was crucial for this evolution, because it was an era when folklore, nationalism, and literature fed each other. As empires modernized, cultural elites often turned to folk tradition to define what was uniquely theirs. This impulse did not create Dead Moroz out of nothing, but it helped present him as a dignified symbol of Russian winter identity. The older Morozko tales provided the raw mythic material. The stage and the printed page provided a new context. It is in this period that we see Grandfather Frost moving from a feared winter spirit into a more ceremonial figure who can enter households not as a threat, but as a guest. The change is not instantaneous and not uniform across regions. Some communities likely held on to the harsher image longer, especially where winter still felt like a direct adversary. But the cultural direction was clear. The Frost King was becoming a winter benefactor, not a winter kidnapper. His stern tests of politeness and humility did not disappear. They became part of a gentler narrative in which a child could prove worthiness with a poem, a song, or good behavior, and be rewarded with sweets and gifts rather than with mere survival. Then the 20th century arrived with a political force that reshaped nearly every cultural ritual it touched. The Soviet Revolution and the early decades of the new regime viewed religious celebrations with suspicion and hostility. Christmas was associated with the church and with a social order the state wanted to dismantle. This created a problem that governments often create when they try to rewrite tradition. You can suppress a holiday on paper. You cannot easily remove it from people's emotional muscle memory. For some time, the winter gift traditions were discouraged, and figures like Grandfather Frost were criticized or pushed to the margins. Yet the public hunger for a family-centered celebration persisted. In the mid-1932, the Soviet state made a strategic pivot by reviving the winter festivities in a secularized form centered on New Year. Ded Moroz was brought back not as a Christian figure, but as a cultural emblem of winter joy that could be framed as national and communal rather than religious. The New Year tree, the public celebrations, and the state-sanctioned appearances of Ded Moroz allowed the regime to offer a controlled version of enchantment without conceding authority to the church. This was a political compromise wrapped in tinsel. But for ordinary families, it meant that the winter elder could return to the living room. This is one of the most intriguing episodes in the life of a myth because it shows how deeply a culture can need its seasonal stories. Ded Moroz became the official gift bringer of New Year celebrations. Children learned to greet him at parties, to recite verses, to participate in an exchange where the gift was not something that arrived unseen in the night, but something given face to face. This detail is often overlooked by outsiders, but it is essential to the character of Grandfather Frost. Santa Claus is a ghostly visitor in many modern versions, a presence inferred by empty cookie plates and the mystery of morning gifts. Ded Moroz is a visible ceremonial elder. The child stands before authority and wonder at once. The exchange becomes social rather than secretive. The myth teaches that joy is communal, that celebration is a shared performance of winter resilience. The Snow Maiden's presence at these events further reinforces that message. She is the youthful, friendly face of the season who makes the elder less intimidating and more approachable, while still preserving the grandeur of winter power that he represents. In the deeper symbolic logic that binds our three faces of winter together, this Soviet-era transformation is not merely a political footnote. It is the moment when the Frost King's ancient authority is redirected into a modern moral economy that sits beside the Nicholas tradition rather than competing with it. The Mediterranean saint teaches secret generosity. The Alpine demon teaches consequence. The Slavic winter elder teaches endurance, transformed into celebration. Each of these figures emerges from a different cultural need, but all of them answer the same seasonal question. How do we cross the darkest part of the year with our humanity intact? The old Morozko story answered it by saying, "Humility before nature will save you." The later Ded Moroz tradition answers by saying, "Community and ritual can make winter not only survivable but meaningful." As the late 20th century and the early years of the 21st century unfolded, Ded Moroz remained a powerful symbol across Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. He became both a cultural icon and a figure of commercial celebration, with appearances in public squares, televised festivities, and family traditions that blended older folklore with new media. The idea of an official home for Ded Moroz in the northern town of Veliki Ustyug became part of modern myth-making, a way of giving the winter elder a tangible address for letters and a landscape that feels appropriately frostbound and grand. The myth once again demonstrates its adaptability. A pre-Christian frost spirit can become a theatrical character. A theatrical character can become a national symbol. A national symbol can become a friendly address for children's wishes. The shape changes. The function endures. At this point in our story, it is worth stepping back and letting the three faces of winter come into the same room, not as a claim of literal historical encounter, but as a mythic convergence that reveals their shared purpose. Imagine a vast winter crossroads that exists outside ordinary geography, a place where the air is so cold it hums and the stars look close enough to touch. On one path comes St. Nicholas, no longer only the Bishop of Myra, but the distilled spirit of generous guardianship, carrying the quiet authority of love used as a shield. On another path comes Krampus, not a loose demon, but a disciplined shadow, the embodiment of consequence that keeps the saint's gifts from being mistaken for entitlement. On the third path comes the Frost King, transformed into Grandfather Frost, tall and calm, staff in hand, wearing the dignity of a nature force that has learned to express kindness without surrendering its power. In this imagined council of winter, each figure understands that the season is too complex for a single story. Children need warmth, yes, but they also need boundaries. Communities need joy, yes, but they also need memory of hardship so that joy does not become fragile or foolish. The three faces do not exist to contradict one another. They exist to complete the emotional architecture of winter. St. Nicholas would be the first to speak in such a scene. He would remind the others that generosity is not merely a holiday custom. It is a social technology. When the poor are supported, societies are less likely to fracture under pressure. When children are protected, the future is less anxious. His origin in the late Roman world lends him historical gravity. He is the human anchor of this seasonal triad. He represents the idea that compassion can be chosen, even when the world is structured to reward selfishness. Krampus would answer with a rougher voice, reminding the council that kindness without discipline can become indulgence, and indulgence can become decay. He is not the enemy of joy. He is the guardian of its meaning. The Alpine tradition that binds him to the saint does so for a reason. It knows that a moral story must be sharp enough to cut through childish self-deception. Grandfather Frost would then speak last. With the patience of a force older than both church and village, he would remind them that winter is not only ethical theatre, it is an environment with real consequences. The myth of endurance, humility, and respect for reality is the oldest lesson of all. The gifts should be joyful. The warnings should be understood. But neither will matter if a culture forgets that nature itself sets the terms of survival. That imagined dialogue helps us see why these figures remain compelling for adults as well as for children. They are not merely cute seasonal mascots. They are symbols of how societies teach values under pressure. The saint, the demon, and the frost elder are each answers to a world that grows darker at the same time every year. We may have electric lights now, central heating, and global supply chains that dull the old fear of scarcity, but the psychological winter remains. People still feel the year tightening in December. They still want the season to mean something beyond consumption. They still turn to myth because myth offers a kind of moral weather report for the heart. In the lived reality of families who celebrate with dead moros, this convergence is felt in small gestures rather than in cosmic councils. A child recites a poem to Grandfather Frost at a new year, gathering and receives a gift, learning that joy can be earned by participation and courtesy. A parent uses the gentler modern language of consequence rather than the harsh threats of older folklore, but the structure remains. The winter elder is watching in a benevolent way. His gifts are not random. They are part of a story that ties behavior to belonging. In the same household, the family might also have absorbed the broader global image of Santa Claus through media. These myths are not mutually exclusive. Modern culture allows them to overlap. A child can believe in both a secret visitor in red and a ceremonial elder in blue, and the emotional effect is a richer, more layered winter imagination. What makes Ded Moroz unique among the winter gift figures is the way his older identity as Morozko never fully disappears. Even in his kinder form, he retains a sense of severity that is more dignified than frightening. His staff is not a prop of whimsy. It is a symbol of control over the season. The idea of winter authority remains intact. The Snow Maiden, too, carries the melancholy beauty of winter's fragility. Her association with snow that can melt underscores an adult truth that children might only sense. The season of joy is temporary. The magic is precious, precisely because it will not last forever in the same way. This is not a sorrowful message, it is a grounding one. The gift is meaningful because it arrives against a backdrop of darkness and will soon be followed by the slow return of light. As this chapter draws toward its closing moments, the transformation of the Frost King into Grandfather Frost feels less like a simple cultural rebrand and more like the final piece of a broader winter mythology that spans continents. We began with a historical bishop whose secret generosity created a tradition of quiet gifts. We traveled to the mountains where a horned punisher evolved into the saint's shadow to preserve the moral balance of the season. We stepped into the Slavic forests where winter was first imagined as a sovereign test and then reshaped into a dignified elder who brings gifts at the turn of the year. These stories are not identical, and they are not born from a single origin. But they harmonize because the human condition in winter has always asked for the same three truths. Be kind, be responsible, respect the power of the world beyond your comfort. On a cold evening in a modern Russian town, you might see the living echo of this long evolution. A public square glows with lights. The New Year tree rises like a green promise against the night. Children cluster in bright coats, their breath visible in the air. An actor dressed as Ded Moroz appears with deliberate ceremony, tall and commanding, his robe sweeping the snow, his staff lifted like a scepter. Beside him, Snegorochka moves with lighter steps, greeting children with warmth that feels like the gentlest form of winter. The children recite their verses, the elder laughs, gifts appear, the crowd cheers. Somewhere behind the spectacle, the older Father Frost still exists in the deep memory of the culture, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what this celebration has survived. The snow continues to fall, softening the sharp edges of the world. The year turns quietly on its hidden axis. Homes fill with the smell of food and the sound of voices that have decided to be together despite everything. In some distant alpine village, bells might still ring for Krampusnacht, and children might still feel the thrill of fear that reassures them that goodness matters. In some Western homes, stockings might still be hung in honor of a saint whose name has traveled far enough to become a universal symbol of December generosity. In the East, Grandfather Frost stands at the threshold of a new year, not as a demon of cold, but as a sovereign of winter joy. Night settles in like a warm cloak over a world of snow. Lamps glow in windows, rooftops gather a silver dusting, and the three faces of the season feel less like separate myths and more like the same ancient human answer spoken in different languages.